So good afternoon and good morning, everyone. My name is Brooks Roach. I'm Manager of Patient Knowledge and Connection with Diabetes Canada. And I'd like to welcome you all to this really exciting webinar presentation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I am joining this webinar from the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So wherever you are joining or watching from, I'll just invite you to take a moment to express recognition and gratitude for the land on which we live and to acknowledge the history of the Indigenous lands that we now call Canada. We are here today to talk about something that will be familiar to almost anyone living with or affected by diabetes. This is an issue present in clinics, in classrooms, workplaces, social circles, and in all these tiny interactions scattered throughout our lives. And what we're going to be talking about is stigma. So we're going to do a few things. We're going to introduce some definitions around stigma, talk about the differences that may exist across types of diabetes and life stages, and then we'll explore some steps that both individuals, groups, organizations can take to help in destigmatizing diabetes. And to do this, we're joined by three incredible guests that I have the pleasure of welcoming. So first, I'd like to introduce Austen McDonald, who is currently an airline pilot with Jazz Aviation or Air Canada Express, flying the Dash 8 Q400. Austen was the first person in the world to earn a commercial pilot's license with pre-existing type 1 diabetes. He holds a BSc in mechanical engineering from the University of Alberta. And welcome, Austen.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here, Brooks.
We're also joined by Dr. Michael Vallis. So Dr. Vallis is a registered health psychologist and lead of the Behavior Change Institute at the QE2 Health Sciences Center in Halifax, and an associate professor in family medicine at Dalhousie University. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
And finally, we're joined by Quentin Valognes, former professional rider and current ambassador for the all Type 1 professional cycling team, Team Novo Nordisk. Welcome, Quentin.
Thank you very much.
So in addition to just having some incredible backgrounds and CVs of what they've been able to do, our experts today will be answering some key questions that they've heard from patients, colleagues, and seen in their work and research. We will also be taking questions from you, our viewers. So you can ask your questions by replying in the comments below on Facebook Live, and we'll do our best to fit those in the Q&A session toward the end of this talk. So feel free to ask those at any point throughout the session, and we'll pass those along to our panelists. So with that, I'd like to dive right in and start with a question to Dr. Vallis. So some foundations first. Michael, what do we mean by stigma, and how might people with diabetes recognize it from their past experiences?
Yeah, I think it's actually really important to address this issue because it's kind of subtle. It's sort of like, under the surface, so it's not immediately obvious. But if we think about it, we start with the individual. So bias refers to individual attitudes or beliefs about the disease and individuals living with diabetes. And then those biased beliefs about diabetes and individuals actually can result in unfair treatment of the person living with diabetes. But then it spreads. And then we have stigma, which is really the societal social stereotypes that exist, that our individuals are exposed to in the normal day-to-day course of their lives. So it's not sort of just at an individual level. We believe very strongly that individual bias has actually crept into the sort of social stereotypes, and that impacts the experience that people have with diabetes.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Michael. To take that into a lived experience or these sort of real-time experiences we might have had, I'd like to ask both Austen and Quentin to share any stories or reflections on when you might have encountered stigma and how you responded or wish you responded, and advice that you might gather from these experiences. So I'll ask that to Austen first.
I've typically found that stigma in diabetes, the diabetes usually goes hand in hand with a lack of understanding or a misconception about the disease. For example, my attempts at getting my commercial pilot medical certificate was pretty much all about trying to dispel myths and stigmas such as all diabetics are very brittle, The treatment technology hasn't changed since the 1970s. Another really important kind of stigma and kind of myth I try to dispel as well is that, my life is controlled by insulin and blood glucose rather than I control my life or my blood group glucose and my insulin requirements around my lifestyle. When it comes to dealing with dispelling this or dealing with this stigma, the motto I use is patience and consistency. For example, when I was working with our governing body, Transport Canada, which issues flight crew licensing, I did wish I practiced a little bit more patience with them. And there's a few times where I quite nearly lost my cool. But once I broke through the barrier and got my license, I found for the most part, everyone in my industry is very happy for me and very curious about what it is like living with diabetes. And to be frank with you, they're really open and wanting to learn more about it, which hopefully helps in dispelling some of the myths and the stigma around the disease.
Yeah, thank you, Austen. Quentin, I'm curious to get your perspective, having had the chance to work as a professional athlete and travel the world, and how you've encountered stigma in your own experience.
Yeah, thank you for the chance to speak there. I was thinking, I have been diagnosed with type 1 when I was 6 years old. I'm 26 right now. And even before being professional rider, things start. It's quite hard for me to remember, because I have to say, all my family were perfect with me. They introduced me to the school. The school were perfect. All the cycling club, the climbing club, all the sport I did before being professional, they were all nice with my type 1 diabetes. The thing, it's quite funny. I remember it's when I was like 13 years old. I was already a cyclist. I am a sprinter. So at the end of the race, we fight with other people. And one day I crashed. So this finger broke. And I had a teacher who planned to make a travel to Italy. And when she saw that I had an injury, she was like, okay, Quentin, you have an injury, so we cannot bring you to Italy with us. The reality is she didn't know what was diabetes, and she was afraid about it. And it's fine, because it's not her fault. I think as athletes, as people living with type 1, it's also our mission, to educate, to explain what is diabetes. So that's my story. And I would add just something. I have also a cat who has type 1, and he got a lot of stigma, because all the time that people come in my home and they see me giving him insulin, they ask me, okay, that's why he's a little bit overweight, because he's type 1. So that kind of things. I know he's upset. We speak after between us, but that's this kind of things.
I appreciate that example, because it's it's so small and specific, but at the same time that illustrates a lot of what people experience on the day-to-day. This sense of like, oh, that explains that, or they're looking for what behavior brought this on, what can I link to the cause here, when in reality it's far more complicated than that. So Michael, another question for you, and it's that we'll have some, and Quentin, you alluded to this, that, you're speaking really with a type 1 focus, and that's the, Team Novo Nordisk is a team of individuals with type 1 diabetes who are cycling. And Michael, I'm curious, because we will have viewers living with both, with either type 1 and type 2 diabetes, as well as some who are caregivers and maybe experiencing it from a different perspective. So our viewership will be diverse from perspectives of age or location, ethnic background. And I'm wondering if you can speak a bit on how all of these factors in a viewer's identity could lead to people experiencing stigma differently.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's actually really important for us to kind of elaborate on that point, Brooks, because we're sort of trying to understand stigma, trying to figure out, okay, what can we do about it? So we're sort of looking for answers. And what I'd encourage us all to think about is, let's find out what the questions are because each individual has to answer these questions for themselves. So bottom line is one size doesn't fit all. So it's important for us not to try to paint everybody with the same brush. So if we kind of flip the question around, we could ask everyone who is listening in, be it someone with diabetes or a caregiver, and they can locate themselves on the dimensions of type of diabetes, age, location, ethnicity, income, etc. And then I would encourage everyone to really ask themselves about their experiences with others. Have you ever encountered these biased attitudes or behaviors from others? And listening to Quentin's example of his cat is really, really interesting, isn't it? Because it kind of shows you, it's a very straightforward one, but it's so illustrative. This cat did not contribute to this bias in any way, shape, or form. This little kitty's just doing what it's doing, and yet people are imposing these attitudes on them. So if we could ask your cat would probably say, hey, this isn't fair. And that's the key. And then we try to really build from that. Are you treated in a manner that makes you feel uncomfortable because of your diabetes? I think that would be the question for everybody to reflect on. Because if you're in the presence of others and you're starting to feel uncomfortable because of your disease, that's when we see the flag for bias and stigma. And then you need to ask if that is shared by others, if the person is aware of their attitude. And so one of the things that is really important, and I love being on a panel like this because we've got some real citizen representations. So we've got Austen and Quentin who live with this disease and have really determined that they're not going to be suppressed by the stigma and the bias. So these are spokespeople who are really willing to take a stand. And that's actually really, really important because we're trying to support the diabetes community in really claiming their voice. So you might ask the person if they're aware of the impact that their attitude has on them. And so if we could ask Quentin's cat, we could ask the kitty, does that make you feel good about yourself or does that make you feel bad? And if it does, then perhaps we could think about how could we potentially raise the issue with the person, or how do we protect ourselves from potentially uneducated and judgmental individuals who aren't interested in a conversation. So the key to my response here is if you experience it, try to link it to where the source is and then make your decision. Is this an important person to me? And if this person is, maybe I could raise the issue with the person. And that might be as simple as just take a Diabetes Canada leaflet and put it on the kitchen table so everybody could see it. Bring it with you when you're at a coffee shop. Put it out there. Something that might cue a discussion. And then you kind of decide, to be honest, who's willing to listen and communicate, and who do I have to protect myself against?
I really appreciate that that framing, Michael. And if I may, I'm curious to pick up on something you mentioned, which I love the acid test of, does this make me uncomfortable? Does this provide me with this sense of, have I done something wrong? Does it make me question my role in all this? And then taking that forward into, can I educate this person? And if I encounter that resistance, can I walk away? Knowing when to find protection. I'm curious if I can ask Austen. I know, Austen, you had a pretty long trek through your advocacy journey in going from to become a licensed pilot. Like it was an uphill climb at times, and I imagine, without naming names, that you would have encountered a lot of folks who wouldn't have understood, or who would have been tempting to walk away. And I'm curious if you can speak a little bit to how you protected your own well-being when you were in those situations.
That's a really, really good question. And absolutely, I did encounter a lot of people that would just say it's not possible, or it can't be done. Not to go into too much detail, but several officials at the government level basically said this is not achievable. And they were medical experts. However, their viewpoint of diabetes hadn't changed from what I thought since 1980s or 1970s. The best advice I could give, again, was the patience and consistency, and having a a fantastic support team. I leaned heavily on my family, and specifically my dad. He was the champion for my fight with all this. So I'd say the key to all this is having an excellent support team to kind of help you vent and help you come to terms with the biases and the stigmas you're facing. Little story I guess I have is my mom, once I was on the phone with Transport Canada, kind of arguing my point about specific kinds of insulins. It was a very, very specific conversation, but it got to the point where I was, vibrating mad off after the phone call. And she just, after I hung up, she took me aside and said, listen, you're doing good. This is going to be a long uphill battle, but you got this, and it's a fight worth fighting. So like I said, having a great support team is massive for this.
Yeah. Thanks, Austen. I appreciate you sharing that. I think a major component to this whole issue, as we've touched on, is a misunderstanding of diabetes or its causes, its severity. A lot of people try to dial down how severe it can be. Its complications, whether they're not aware or they don't really grasp the interconnection with that this can be a really severe, really dangerous condition to live with. And I'm wondering, what have you found to be the keys to shifting how people understand? We've talked about that importance, or that duty in some cases, to educate others, to help people clear that hurdle of understanding. What have you found helpful to help change how others understand or think about or speak about diabetes? So it could be family, friends, healthcare providers, Transport Canada, or it takes a lot of forms. Quentin, I'm wondering if you can share.
Yeah, I think first of all we need to think also about how we are thinking about our diabetes ourselves. Small story: when I have been diagnosed, I was like, why me? Why, when my diabetes is not well controlled, people are upset about me, my parents, the doctors, and all of them. And why me, not my friend, not my brother, not my sister? I did not understand what happens. So I start to fight against my diabetes at this point. Then when I was 14, and I met for the first time Team Novo Nordisk, with only athletes with type 1 diabetes, I was like, wow, they are like me. They are as I want to be. And then they invite me to a training camp in Atlanta, Georgia. I was there, and the CEO and the co-founder of the team, Phil Sutherland, spoke to us and asked us questions. What do you think about diabetes? How do you see it? So I explained. My English was perfectly bad at this moment, but I understood this sentence. And I was like, okay, I fight against my diabetes. And Phil said one thing that changed my life. He said, okay, Quentin, if this works for you, perfect. But don't forget, diabetes only choose champions. So, okay, it's marketing, it's whatever you want. But for a young kid with a lot of dreams, that changed my life. From this, I learned to use our difference to make the difference.
I think that's worth repeating, to use the difference to make a difference. It's interesting because it can be a lot on our shoulders to feel responsibility to take everything on top of the demands of living with diabetes. And using the difference is an interesting, really great perspective. Austen, can you speak to this a little bit?
I can, and I like to say I really like the analogy diabetes only chooses champions. That's a really, really good one, and it shows how we have to be resilient and have to be tough, so to speak. But talking about misunderstanding and having to kind of educate, one of my favorite kind of segues into doing this, to educating, is are you sure you can have that cake or ice cream, or how many needles do you give yourself a day? And the analogy I use nowadays with kind of the way car technology is going is diabetes control is just like an autopilot for those fancy new Tesla cars, or even for the airplanes I fly, where everyone without diabetes has this perfectly good autopilot that manages everything for them. They almost don't even have to think about it. Whereas us, we have to think as if we're driving a 1960s Mustang with 3 gears, let alone even cruise control. And so that's kind of one of the analogies I use to provide education and kind of show the misunderstanding that a lot of people have with diabetes. And I think that's really in my opinion, analogies are a great way to educate people. A little side story about understanding is that actually one of my best friends is a medical student right now, and during his first year, they made him have diabetes for a week exercise, where he had to test his blood sugar 4 to 6 times a day. He had to give himself saline shots to simulate insulin, carb counted, did all what we do on a daily basis, day in and day out. And during that week, we had a little get together with him, and with him and a few other friends, and he pulled me aside and said, I never really understood what this was like. And this is only a fraction of what you go through every day. And so having somebody recognize that, it was massive. And I hope more and more people today get to learn from this, from these webinars, as well as from Diabetes Canada information pamphlets about what this disease is and what we're capable of doing.
Yeah, thanks, Austen. Michael, I'd like to turn the same question your way, and I just wanted to add something that came to mind, and it's, I can imagine some folks may be watching this and might struggle to view themselves as a champion, might struggle to really grasp that it can feel sometimes like a burden to have to go out and keep doing your best and performing it's at a high level just to do what seems like what everyone else can do so easily. And whether that's educating others or just going about your day, it can at times feel really tough. I'm wondering if you can speak to the role of, burnout and this sense of consistent motivation when it comes to tackling this.
Yeah, absolutely. So if people are sort of listening, notice how this conversation has been going. We start with stigma, which is this subtle societal level assumptions that people make. And it's true, it's there. We cannot deny it. And so it's really important for individuals like Quentin and Austen to call it out in the experience of their lives. Critically important for Diabetes Canada to really champion this, to take this forward. But stigma then is really based on misunderstanding, which really is about being uneducated. And so ignorant in the descriptive way. People just don't know better. Most of the individuals who people encounter actually are not bad people wanting to do you harm. They're simply following the sort of general beliefs that we have. Like, if you're really, really sick, if you've got a life-threatening disease, shouldn't you have an IV pole hanging on you and you're walking around in a Johnny shirt? Or how long are you going to live? Look at Austin's wearing an Air Canada suit, and Quentin is wearing an athlete's jersey. They can't be sick. If they were sick, I would know they were sick. So it can't be that serious. So these are just very kind of natural sorts of beliefs. We need to look to the media. There was a paper just published, and we have a journal in Canada called the Canadian Journal of Diabetes. And a group in Montreal just published a paper in which they looked at some of the misbeliefs presented by TV and movies, in which there's what you and citizens see on the screen promotes misunderstanding. Oh, the person is in a coma. Oh, they're diabetic. Give them insulin. And, or the great big needles, get brought out when people are, so there's a lot of reasons that we understand that. So it's really important that we, look for these opportunities to re-educate. And that's what can happen at a broad level. And right now in our society, we sort of need Diabetes Canada, and we need people like Quentin and Austen to sort of call it out. But let's be honest, most of us are just ordinary people with ordinary lives. But those are where the extraordinary accomplishments really happen. And so everybody talks about, particularly type 1 diabetes, it's like, oh, those poor people. Let me share something with you as a psychologist. People living with type 1 diabetes, especially if they've been diagnosed as children, end up being, as adults, less neurotic than the average person and better friends. And let me show you what I mean. Most of us are privileged. We grow up in a society in which we're safe. And so we kind of get neurotic. I wanted a blue one and they sent me a red one. Oh my goodness, let me complain because I really wanted the blue one and they sent me a red one. Well, if you're living with diabetes and you're having, worrying about nocturnal hypoglycemia, you don't care about blue and red. So you're actually less neurotic. You're actually more able to focus in on what's important in life. And also, friendships. Most people are fair weather friends. It's like, oh, let's go out to a party. Oh, I'm not doing so well. I think I'm just going to sort of go for a walk and sit and stare at the stars. Oh, well, we'll be at the pub if you need us. Whereas someone living with diabetes who every day recognizes the burdens, is likely to say, oh, okay, I'll sit with you. So I think it's really important for us to understand that there are definitely burdens, but it's really the opportunity to act on those burdens. And what we really need to do is establish and call this conversation out so that we can begin to promote more correct types of models. And we should call out the industry around how people are presented. So there's a movie called The Whale that's just been released with Brendan Fraser playing a super obese man with type 2 diabetes, and people from Obesity Canada actually were involved in the script. So we're beginning to see some of this openness. So it's very much true that diabetes can be a burden, but in fact, life isn't about happiness. Life is about meaning. And people living with diabetes often have the opportunity, if they have support, to actually bring meaning to their own lives. So we're starting with the talk on stigma, but what we're really trying to do is promote well-being, or what we call empowerment. So people actually are able to actualize. And by the way, people living with diabetes who are doing the least amount to take care of their diabetes are healthier in their behavior than the average Canadian. So before people start thinking about what they're not doing, they need to recognize the average Canadian's diet is a mess, their activity is a mess, their stress management is a mess, and the average person living with diabetes is way more advanced in terms of knowledge of nutrition and knowledge of how to manage their lives. So it's interesting, isn't it, in a way, and that strengths really develop through hardship. So there's the burden element, but we believe, I'm a health professional in diabetes, and we really do believe that there's an opportunity for empowerment, and people like Quentin and Austen are really necessary right now because they are kind of trailblazers and they show us the way. And I hope I didn't talk too long.
Not a worry, Michael, because that was really a beautiful answer. I think it's really resonant that sort of the power in the everyday and the recognition that a lot of, to go through, or the old language of suffering from diabetes.
Yes.
Well, there's a lot of strength that can be built through the problems that are inherent to it, the challenges that have to be solved by definition, living with this. Yes. They build things up.
Yeah. Just I won't elaborate, just want to let the audience know, if you're interested in this language issue, recently Diabetes Canada published in the Canadian Journal, and it can be accessed through the website, a very important paper called Language Matters. And it's very accessible, it's not an academic paper, and it will just give you an explanation of the damage done by these judgmental types of words. And it calls out some of the words and some of the strategies. So it might be informative to the audience, and it would certainly be something that you might want to if you had a friend who was trying to help, like maybe I'm trying to help Austen and I say, Austen, should you really be eating that? Because I don't know. And maybe Austen, if he feels comfortable, might give me this paper to read, which, by the way, is quite informative.
Yeah, it's an excellent example. I've just, I think we'll be posting that in the chat if anyone's interested on Facebook in the comments. This is a great conversation. And before we dive into a couple of questions that folks are submitting, I just want to ask, what, and we've touched on it a little bit, but the actions that we can really take. We've talked about this call is a real privilege because we're dealing with people that have taken a lot of action to change the conversation. What advice or what action would you suggest, or would you share with people affected by diabetes, with organizations or media or viewers who want to, once this webinar is over, go out and be able to make some changes? And I'll ask that to Quentin first.
Thank you. I would say, I will come back to the team Novo Nordisk. Our mission there is to inspire, educate, and empower people living with diabetes around the world. And I think it's the mission of everyone living with diabetes. We have to inspire, to be proud of our diabetes and to live with it. I won't repeat what just Michael said, but I definitely agree. So I think the best way is to be proud of ourselves.
Thank you. Austen.
Diabetes isn't what it used to be compared to when I was diagnosed around 10, 15 years ago, let alone back in the 1980s, the 50s, or even the 30s. Pardon the airplane pun, but the sky's the limit for those living with diabetes. I try to demonstrate as many people as I can that this is possible. When I was first diagnosed at 14 years old, I was told by the social worker at the Stollery Children's Clinic that in terms of careers, anything is possible. You can do anything you want except serve in the military or be a professional airline pilot. And I managed to myself take away one of those answers. Like that is now off the table. You can become a professional airline pilot. And that's something I'm proud of doing. And I'm very proud to say that I have removed a barrier from those living with diabetes. To say the least, we have come so far. We have such great treatments and technologies, and we're this close to a cure. But my advice until then is that we shouldn't stop. We shouldn't say we're doing good enough. And we shouldn't pat ourselves on the back and call it a day. We need to continue to keep pushing forward, but at the very least, take care of ourselves and make sure we manage our treatment of diabetes appropriately. From that basis, from managing your diabetes and taking care of yourself, anything is possible. It's the starting foundation, I believe, for anything.
Yeah, thank you, Austen. It's good. It's a great point. You have to, as they say, fill the watering can before you can water the plants. So taking care of yourself first is a great foundation. So folks, we're going to open the floor to questions. We have a few that have rolled in, and the first is one that I'll ask to Quentin. And this person is wondering, as an athlete with type 1, what steps do you take to manage blood glucose while you're on a race or preparing? And what advice do you have for young athletes? And what I would add is, how do you add to this the time that it takes to prepare those around you to know what you might need as an athlete to know how to support you?
Thank you for the question. I would say when you are living with diabetes, what we ask you is to have a good way of life at the end of the day. What we ask to an athlete, it's to have a good way of life. So here we have an advantage, I would say. When I go to the pro level, I was roommate with another pro rider in another team without diabetes, and we compare what we ate and all these kind of things, And now there is some company making some CGM for non-diabetic people for sports and performance. And he is using this kind of things. And at the end of the day, I am making less variability, I would say, less. I manage better my diabetes than him, even if he is not diabetic. So that's exactly what you said before, Michael. But yeah, that's an advantage. After, what I would say, we are all different. Every diabetes is different. What works for me won't work for someone else. So the thing is to find your way, the way to find different zone, the zone for a long physical exercise, a short physical exercise. And when you go down of this zone, then you can eat differently if you go down very fast, if you go down very slow, or the same if you go higher, very fast or very, very slow. I think the thing is to find your way.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Quentin. I have someone that's shared that they've faced some criticism of their diabetes self-management, even in the context of a healthcare provider, when they've been referred to another specialist or someone that's in passing getting access to their records and may not be trained, may not be a specific, may not be their endocrinologist or their care team, but going in, for example, for pre-surgery admission. And I'm curious, I'll pose this to Michael, if you have any thoughts on addressing this or navigating that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really important question. And just to sort of normalize the context. So you mentioned about burden. And one of the things that we've really focused on in the last number of years is what we're calling diabetes distress. And so we really very strongly believe that everyone living with diabetes in a medical context should be screened for diabetes distress. And when we talk about diabetes distress, it's really interesting if we think about it in 4 components. The emotional burden of living with diabetes, that sort of emotional weight that can get heavy at times. The regimen distress, the distress associated with all of the tasks and the work. But importantly, 2 other aspects of distress, what we call social support distress, which is that kind of stuff that we're talking about with other people. And then my favorite aspect of diabetes distress, we call provider-based distress, where individuals living with diabetes get systematically sort of judged by healthcare providers. And what's really interesting is that, and this represents a lot of the work that we're doing in Canada, is that sometimes the medical profession can sort of look at things in terms of what's the diagnosis, what's the treatment, and let's implement the treatment and then see the outcome. And they do that in a way that's really simplified, almost as if it was surgery, where the surgeon is in charge, they do their thing, and it works. That's not how chronic disease or diabetes is managed. It's really about the complexity of that. And so a lot of clinicians will sort of be trained in, here's the problem, here's the solution, why aren't you doing it? And there's a really strong initiative in amongst the sort of chronic disease management to really flip that around and do what we call patient-centered care. And so the next time anyone experiences this with their medical provider, depending on how comfortable you are, you might actually sort of respond to that treatment by sort of saying, are you aware of the Canadian clinical practice guidelines for diabetes management? Do you believe that chronic disease has to involve the patient? And these are questions. What's interesting, I spend most of my time training doctors how to really communicate and support people living with diabetes and other chronic diseases. And one of the things that I've learned, and I really hope that this comes across, is that if the doctor knows that they're missing the mark with you, they will not be happy with themselves. So if you sit there passively taking that treatment, they won't know. That's the problem with that, because these doctors, in fact, are uneducated. They would say, diabetes is a glucose regulatory disorder, and here are some therapies that will correct that. So the evidence says they work, so do it. What could be simpler? And in fact, that's completely wrong. And if we can start to communicate this back, and so we did something a number of years ago, we called it it was part of a study called Diabetes Attitudes, Wishes, and Needs, and it was called DAWN, D-A-W-N. And we called it the DAWN experiment, which is we just encourage people living with diabetes to say to their healthcare provider, can I ask you, doctor, why haven't you ever asked me how diabetes affects my life? That one question was a bit of a groundbreaker, because all of a sudden the doctor goes, oh, okay, well, how does it affect your life? And this, you see, if we start with stigma and it's subtle and it's at a societal level, what do we do about that? But if we start at the micro level, between you and the person who's making you feel uncomfortable, then you can see change happening. So it's actually a super important issue to identify that, and really is that this word, notice that Quentin's sort of raison d'etre in his team is empowerment. That's part of their initiative. And I would like to, link us back to small changes, to empowerment happens in little bits. Right now, we need these iconic figures like Quentin and Austen to sort of show us the path. But then we don't expect everybody to turn into these groundbreaking accomplishments. What we are trying to do is use as an example for people to find their victories that they can. Because remember, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single footstep.
Michael, thank you again for just a wonderful answer, and we've shared the clinical practice guidelines in the Facebook comments as a reference point if with a healthcare provider, because can be really helpful to come into an engagement like that armed with some knowledge, armed with something that can help that person learn.
I don't want to interrupt you, but let's be honest. If you're not talking to a diabetes specialist, you know so much more about your disease than that family doctor, that surgeon, that physiotherapist. That I don't think that just because they've got a diploma on the degree, on the a degree on the wall, that that gives them more knowledge than you. You live this disease, you know this disease, and if we start to bring that voice forward, we really believe that will change the conversation. And again, I'll just end by saying, if the doctor knows that they're not hitting the mark, that they will not be comfortable with that, and that can shift that dynamic where they can do more listening than speaking.
Fantastic. One more question that we have is, and I might pose this to the three of you because you'd have I'm sure an interesting but a slightly different perspective on it. And the question is, what advice would you give to kids in building their confidence around diabetes stigma? To someone who's young, who's encountering a lot of this maybe for the first time, still learning sort of social rules of engagement, how do they advise to approach this, whether for the child themselves or for a caregiver or a friend to support them? I might pose that to Austen first. Any thoughts you have?
I would say don't be ashamed of it. Wear it as a badge of, I want to say honor is the wrong word, but embrace it. Embrace it as a unique part of who you are and what makes you different to others. Don't be ashamed of it. It's something that can be cool as well. You can kind of show all the cool toys you have extra, or diabetes Christmas when you get a new pump or a new CGM or something like that. That's a unique experience for people, and it's something that you can embrace as being unique.
Quentin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with you, Austin. Thank you for this. And I would say it's normal to have this different step before the resilience, to be upset, to try to negotiate with the diabetes, and then to depress,
Mm-hmm.
and then to have the resilience. That's normal. And even when you are the resilience, then you come back to the fight with your diabetes, because it's not perfect all the time. Even when you don't have diabetes, it's not perfect all the time. So that's normal. That's what I would say.
Michael, any advice?
So I would say, don't try to fix what's not broken. I love kids. I think kids are a great example. We should learn from the children in two ways, because children don't get stuck in old ideas. I've been doing this for years, and so kids are in a developmental stage. They're innocent. They're learning about the world, and so they incorporate. So they absorb diabetes much easier than adults do. And the second thing about children that's really lovely is children without diabetes, they just get it, right? So let's imagine that Quentin is 8 years old and I say, Quentin, what are you doing? You're sticking yourself with a needle. And he says, yeah, I've got this diabetes. I have to take this 3 times. Oh, cool. Can you give it to me, Quentin? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, look at that. They don't start doing all this judgmental stuff. A lot of the challenges with children are, excuse my language, the parents and the system. We heard about, oh, you can't go to Italy because you've got a broken finger. What? That's ridiculous, right? But it's because you're living with type 1 diabetes and a broken finger that we don't think you should go to Italy, which is not fair. So I think it's really interesting. I would make the note that with adolescents, it's a little delicate, because what we need to do is try to protect adolescents from their diabetes so that they can do what they're meant to do, which is to be as different from their parents as they possibly can be, and as most like their friends as they can possibly be. That's a normal stage of development. And so it makes it important to get good care in adolescence. But generally, I would leave the children alone. By the way, most psychological interventions with children are directed towards the parents and managing the parents' anxiety. And we kind of try to leave the kids alone, because they are actually, I love to see how kids adapt, because they we heard from Austen, it just becomes cool. So I think it's a great point. And I find, as a psychologist, you don't really work to help people with type 1 diabetes diagnosed as children with the self-management tasks. That's like drinking water for them. It's the adults who have been stuck in patterns for years that struggle to change. So I think it's a great comment.
Yeah. Folks, that's all for audience submitted questions. But what I'd just like to close off with is, to our audience, I'd like to thank those that have submitted your questions, and I'd like to say that to learn more and stay up to date on what we're doing at Diabetes Canada on this topic and beyond, you can visit diabetes.ca. You can visit our social media at Diabetes Canada. And if you want specific direction, you can call 1-800-BANTING or email info@diabetes.ca if you have any questions. And finally, I'd just like to one more time turn the floor to our guests. If you have anything final that you'd like to share, anything that you're struck by after this conversation, or that you'd want to leave our audience with, some final remarks. So I'll pass it. Maybe we'll go back through that order in reverse, and I'll hand the floor to Michael.
Yeah, my words here are way less important than listening to what Quentin and Austen have to say about this. But what I would really just want to say is kind of, keep your friends close and protect yourself from those people who aren't willing to listen to you. We need to really create an environment that really matches us. And so I think that would be my comment. And I'm really interested in hearing what the real experts have to say about this.
Quentin, your thoughts?
Yeah, first it will be a comment to Michael. When I ask my cat what he thinks about it, I don't ask him really. I ask the neighbor why he is gaining weight, and it's because all my neighbor give to him some food. So not diabetes, that's the thing. And after, yeah, it's once all these reminders are done perfectly. When I speak about reminder, is having a good environment, good friend, good family, like explaining to family, explaining to friend what is diabetes. Once everything is done, just one more time, we have to use our difference to make the difference.
Thank you, Quentin. And Austen.
Like I said earlier, have patience, have consistency, and like Michael and Quentin have emphasized, have a good support system, good friends, good family, know who you're surrounding yourself with, who can support you when you need them. That I think is the big takeaway, I think, in this when it comes to stigma with diabetes.
Yeah. Well, listen, Austen, Quentin, Michael, I'd like to just sincerely thank the three of you for a really fantastic conversation and for being willing to share your own experiences and your expertise. And I know it's, personally living with diabetes, this has been a really wonderful session to be part of. And I hope that it's been helpful for our audience as well. So a sincere thank you to the three of you. And to our audience, feel free to get in touch with further questions, and we'll be happy to assist wherever possible. So thank you and take care, and use your difference to make a difference, as they say.
Thank you, Brooks. Thank you, Diabetes Canada.
Thank you.
Thank you.